So we have the recording now. So hello and welcome. My name is Damla B, Aksel, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Bahçeşehir University. And today I am going to be moderating our webinar on governing migration and asylum in times of crisis, which is actually a part of Bahçeşehir University Department of Political Science and International Relations webinar series. So for the last weeks, we have been having these webinars thanks to the technology, and we are able to bring together distinguished scholars together to discuss very important topics in our daily lives. Today we are going to be talking about migration and asylum, and more specifically on the governance of migration and asylum. And this is a topic that has become more and more pertinent in our global age, current age, in many regions around the world. But for our purposes for today, it has really become a very, very important topic over the last 5 years, especially since 2015, in the context of Turkey and European Union relations, and what has been taking place in these two regions, in Turkey and the European Union, within these regions as well. At the moment we are currently living through a very bizarre period with the COVID-19, and this pretty much preoccupies most of what we discuss in our everyday lives, at least until we had this Blackout Tuesday. But before we had the lockdown in Turkey, migration was a very hot issue. As you might all remember, Turkish state had announced to open its borders to migrants and refugees who aim to go to Europe. As I had mentioned before, this was not a novel issue, but rather the continuity of a past phenomenon coming from 2015, but even more, even before earlier. 2015 was considered as named as a refugee crisis by many people, but it was not a crisis of refugees according to as I am thinking of it, but it was a crisis of the management of asylum and migration by the countries that were involved in this issue. So how migration was managed since 2015 and before that in Europe and in Turkey is a very important issue to discuss in order to be able to understand what we experienced during this period in February and today and in our future. So this will be a topic to discuss, and it is very important to know about what happened back then and to know about what currently takes place. It is also very important to critically evaluate and to come up with and suggest better alternatives as academics that might be beneficial for some of the least advantaged populations. The experience of COVID-19 also showed us that not only in Turkey but Europe and everywhere actually, that refugees and migrants are often the most vulnerable populations, especially under conditions where there is uncertainty. And it also showed us that despite the distinctions of nationality, ethnicity, and other ideational factors, we are somehow linked to one another, and the well-being of one person in the society depends very much, or the well-being of the whole society depends very much on the well-being of one individual. So before I go further, I would like to present our very distinguished panelists, and it is my great pleasure to be introducing them today. So we have today Birgit Glorius, who is a professor for human geography with focus on European migration research at Chemnitz University of Technology in Germany. Her research interests and majority of her publications are in the fields of international migration, demographic change, and geographies of education. and most of her research is carried out in Eastern Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, and the Western Balkans. Her research focuses on the reception and integration of asylum seekers and refugees in Europe, notably on questions of local governance and local reception cultures. And we had a chance to work together with Birgit during a Horizon 2020 project named the Evaluation of Common European Asylum System and recommendations for further development. So this was SEAS Eval project, in which Mira Koç was a partner and Ahmet Hoca and I were the researchers for the Turkish team. It was a very, very productive and well-structured project, and Birgit was the leading researcher for this project. And I think it was a very good project in terms of approaching to this issue from a very critical perspective, but also bringing together quality research with many important researchers working in the field. I am going to move on to Ahmet Hoca, Ahmet İçduygu. We have been working together like nearly, like it will be 10 years next year, I think. So I owe most of my knowledge on migration to him. So it is a pleasure for me to introduce him. He is former Dean of College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Koç University, and currently he holds a dual appointment as professor at the Department of International Relations and in Sociology. He is also the Director of Migration Research Center at Koç University, Mira Koç. And he has been writing, publishing, teaching on like every aspect on international migration that you might think of relating to Turkey and elsewhere. Thank you both for joining us today. And accepting to become share your own research. So I just want to talk a bit about the structure today. So we will start with Birgit's presentation on the effects of COVID on asylum policy around Europe. We will continue with my talk, which will make a somehow bridge across Turkey and Europe, talking about migration management in the context of Turkey-EU relations. And last but not least, we are going to have Ahmet Hoca, who will present his new, very new research on stranded migrants in Turkey, the importance of good governance to reach out to and support vulnerable populations. So microphones of the participants, who are all welcome today, they are turned off. So if you have any questions, you may post them on the chat section here. You might see below the presentation, and we will do the question and answer session after all the presentations. But you might post your questions while listening. So the floor is yours, Birgit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Damla, and I'm really happy to be here and to see you again. As Damla already said, we had a very productive cooperation in the context of our Horizon project. And well, actually, I have to upload my presentation quickly.
Sorry, I'm stopping it.
So I will see. This one should be mine. Yes, wonderful. This works. Great. So we are in a very strange times, but in the end we have those digital technology opportunities, and so we are doing things that we are usually not doing, meeting in a very convenient fashion on the internet and being able to discuss, and I enjoy this event already now a lot. Okay. So I will quickly show you through my presentation. I will first talk a little bit about actually some results of our research on the Common European Asylum System, which we did in this Horizon project, the status quo ante kind of. The asylum crisis or asylum policy crisis of 2015, and what we basically found out and what is the basis for understanding what is happening now. This would be my second point, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the European asylum governance, and a very short outlook, because I find it really difficult to make an outlook on the whole situation. So looking into quickly some research of our project, what you need to know is that we had two terms which were important for us, that were the terms harmonization and solidarity, and under those umbrella we did our research. We looked at the status of harmonization of the common European asylum governance in the different EU countries, and we looked if solidarity, which is a key principle for the European integration process and the collaboration between all those countries, if solidarity is existent in those policy practices, and if so, how. And we did that in a very integrative perspective. We did a lot of different pieces of research, and there were a great number of countries which collaborated, so that we really could get a very good overview. And one key point in our research was that we did not only look at the legal perspectives, but we also looked at the local practices. So we really went down to the field, to the borders, to reception conditions, and really looked how are those policies implemented on the ground. And this leads me to my first result of this research. We looked at, as I said, on the harmonization of the common European asylum policies. And what you can see in this figure is that there are two perspectives you can take if you evaluate those policies. We saw that there is quite a lot of harmonization already going on in the common European asylum governance, but this is mainly if you go to the technical parts of it, like the different directives, qualification directive, asylum procedures directive, and so on. This is like those technical parts are quite harmonized, but if you come to the implementation and transposition of those directives in the national law, and then further down on the practices of implementing those, you come to an issue where it becomes very political, meaning that all those directives have to be negotiated, how they are implemented. And we saw some specific points which are still under our concern today, and that's what you can see in those green fields here, the question of relocation. Not only resettlement, but also relocation, like among the European member states, relocation of asylum seekers, the situation in the hotspots, the resettlement issue, the EU-Turkey agreement, and also the question of disembarkation, of like having harbors where people can disembark. So those questions are political issues, and they rely on negotiation processes among all those actors. And these are not only state actors, but there is a multitude of different actors on different levels, also NGOs, also what we saw a lot, municipalities, like city networks, and above all, it's a question of general diplomacy, like the general understanding how countries collaborate with each other. And that's a question which is also the basis for understanding how asylum or migration governance is implemented today in times of COVID-19. A second point was that we saw, we did research on the public opinion, the development of public opinions on migration, and we saw basically in all the countries we did research in that there was a lot of politicization going on, meaning that discourses in the public, in the media, and in the political sphere interacted with each other, were growing, were becoming more polemic, and were more and more instrumentalized. So we saw in some countries that while the numbers of immigrants and of asylum seekers went down, the concerns were increasing. And that showed us that immigration or the discussion about immigration that don't always follow facts, but may become highly symbolic. And yeah, that's also an issue that politicians have to take care about, and also the media, and also like everybody of us in our daily communication, I think. The third point I want to highlight regarding our research on the situation of the asylum system in 2015 and later was the implementation as a multi-level governance process, like meaning that different governance levels were acting together. And making this very brief, we saw that there was a lot of heterogenization going on in the context of accelerated and increased arrival numbers. And for us, the most important issue was that we saw a lot of locally based solutions, meaning that localities really brought their individual strengths to the fore and collaborated on a horizontal level, and sometimes really invented very innovative reception solutions, or solutions also for integration. And this was for us a very important finding where we could also build upon when we look into the crisis condition today. And then in the last step of this project, we did something really, really nice. I think we did a series of scenario workshops where we discussed our results. And we did some predictions about how the common European asylum system could develop in the next years based on our findings, and gave this back into discussions with different stakeholders. And I also won't go deeply into this. This is just like graphic recording of those scenario workshops. What you can see here are 4 different scenarios. They are all circulating around the question how international protection is understood, if member states understand it as a collective good that everybody should collaborate in, or if they don't understand it as a collective good. And the second was the willingness to transfer sovereignty from the national level to the European level. And so we ended up into 4 different scenarios. One was like the breaking apart into different national asylum systems. The second was a cooperation among sovereign asylum systems. Then we had one very positive scenario which thought about a common European asylum system for the future. And then we saw a condition of mini Schengen, meaning that we had like a European Union of different directions, like one block of countries that was collaborating in a very intensive way and kept borders open for European citizens, and thus also implemented the common European asylum system, and another group of countries that did not want to collaborate that deeply in the asylum governance, and thus also had to abandon the Schengen system. So as you can see, the crucial issues here are the Schengen, like the free mobility on the one side, and the Dublin regulation on the other side. The Dublin regulation is the question about the responsibility of the member states for checking and processing the asylum application. The second was the redistribution, the relocation of asylum seekers in the context of burden sharing. And then, of course, the idea of giving away national sovereignty. And those 3 aspects are still today, I think, really crucial if we look on the impact of COVID-19 on the European asylum governance. We see those 3 issues of relocation, of hotspots, which means like responsibility sharing or not, and the question of disembarkation. And I will quickly go into those issues. The first is the question of resettlement and relocation. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic caused a lot of mobility restrictions for everybody, like all of us, but of course it's the most vulnerable people who are most affected by that, by the border closures. For example, the European Union on March 17th imposed a temporary entry restriction for non-European citizens. Many countries stopped their asylum procedures, like really stopped checking asylum applications or stopped accepting asylum applications during that time. The resettlement efforts of international organizations like the UNHCR or the IOM were suspended with the argument of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have, as a very obvious effect of this crisis, we have still those overcrowded refugee camps on the Greek islands. And if you just remember, a couple of weeks back in January, February of this year, there was an effort on the European Union level to evacuate the most vulnerable groups from those camps and redistribute them. And this was totally stopped under the pandemic conditions in the end, but only like in the mid of April, there was a tiny number of 12 unaccompanied minors which were evacuated from Moria to Luxembourg, and then a couple of days later 47 minors who went to Germany, who are in the moment in quarantine for 2 weeks, and then they will be redistributed to some municipalities who are ready to receive them and to take care of them. But there are about 40,000 people on those totally overcrowded refugee camps in the Greek islands with really terrible hygienic conditions. And if the pandemic will hit those camps, it will have really devastating effects. So how can we explain this? If we look in the German example, for example, I told you that we had those 47 unaccompanied minors who were accepted after long negotiations. At the same time, there were some charter flight machines who carried around 80,000 labor migrants from Eastern Europe to Germany, who are working as seasonal labor migrants in the agriculture, like for asparagus and for those season fruits that needs a lot of manual workers. So there was first the lockdown, border closures, and then this negotiation about the labor market and about the demand of the employers. And there, as an effect, 80,000 people were flown to Germany. And this it can be interpreted in the context of border studies knowledge as the filtering effect of borders. What van Hortung, for example, elaborated for us, that we have under conditions of a very competitive border praxis, we have a filtering effect, which means that we have groups of migrants who are interpreted as being productive and who are let in, and we have another group of migrants who are interpreted as not being productive, and under those conditions of neoliberalism, they are kept out. So this is actually an old finding which is still very, very valid today. Next point is the question of disembarkation. The rescue missions in the Mediterranean are a contested issue since many years in the European Union, and we had always phases where that we had rescue missions from the European Union or from some member states, and then the missions were stopped, and then civil society organizations, NGOs, stepped in and started implementing rescue missions. And what happened under the conditions of COVID-19 was that the harbors were closed. For example, the governments of Italy and Malta stopped rescue missions and closed the harbors also for those NGO rescue ships. There was some really spectacular examples where ships were really held away for more than 2 weeks until they could disembark the migrants they had rescued on sea. And what you can see on this photo here, that's a campaign which says free the rescue boats, and this is bringing to our mind that some of those NGO rescue ships are held back in the harbors under some technical arguments, and they are not allowed to go on sea again. And also regarding the German rescue missions, there was a letter from the German Ministry of the Interior. There's a citation from this letter which recommended to those rescue missions to not go out on sea because under the COVID conditions it's not possible to diplomatically help those ships to disembark their rescued people. But at the same moment, we have a number of bottom-up reactions. Actually, already before the COVID, like in 2019, in 2018 already, we had an initiative which is called the Cities of Safe Harbor movement. I think today there are around 50 German cities which joined this movement, and this is these are municipalities who agreed to accept people who were rescued from the Mediterranean, who accept them, to pick them up in those harbors, bring them to Germany, and then care for their asylum procedure and for the reception. And as, for example, in this quote here, a municipal representative of the city of Düsseldorf, regarding the condition of those 40,000 migrants stranded on the Greek island, said, "We can take in those people at once and directly. We have enough capacities in German municipalities and we can take them all." Likewise, the mayor of the city of Potsdam, and the city is also a member of this network of cities of safe harbors, also says the numbers of those cities who are ready to solve the humanitarian crisis, this number is increasing every day. So we see, not only in Germany, this is just one example from Germany, we see a strong call from the local level who says we are ready to do more, to implement more solidarity in this situation. The last observation regarding the impact of COVID-19 is what this does with the integration efforts of those asylum seekers and refugees who arrived since 2015. And what we can see, not only in Germany, but in most of the European countries, is really a rollback of integration success we already had. I brought you a figure here, which is a comparison of occupation of refugees in the German labor market between end of 2017 to end of 2018. As you can see that the number of occupied refugees quickly increased. It was in the end of 2018, there was about 1/3 of all those refugees who came since 2015 already were regularly employed in the German labor market. And there was the forecast that until today, it could be about half of them, 50%. And now, when we had those lockdowns, it caused a severe economic crisis, which will take us, occupy us the next years probably. And unfortunately, especially those spheres of the labor market where many refugees are employed, like the hospitality sector or the temporarily organized labor, they are mostly affected by this. So many of those refugees lost their jobs and now have really difficulties to pay their rent and to come by. Then we have, due to the lockdown, we have children had to go back to homeschooling, and as we all know, this causes a lot of social discrepancies between groups who have private resources like private technologies for homeschooling, and of course who also have well-educated parents and parents who are capable of the educational language. And so the children of refugee families, who mostly have families who cannot speak the educational language very well and cannot support them a lot, have most of those difficulties. Then if you look in the group accommodations of refugees and first reception facilities, which are usually huge group accommodations where people are really also crowded in shared sleeping rooms and so on, we already have a number of corona outbreaks in those group facilities, and we have a large number of refugees and asylum seekers who are under quarantine. And the NGOs, which are usually coming to those group accommodations and offering all kinds of personal consultancy, cannot implement their work under the conditions of COVID-19. So we see now that we have a severe rollback of integration, success, and coming back to those considerations about politicization, we can imagine that this can easily be instrumentalized by the political parties who are very critical on the effects of migration and the effects of humanitarian migration. I don't know how much time I already used. Probably I used it all, but this is my last slide. And my outlook, what can you imagine? And I will also start my outlook with the figure. This is a comparison of resettlement efforts, meaning like structured resettlement from first arrival countries organized by international organizations, and I compared the resettlement activities of the USA and Canada. This is the black group here, and then the EU member states, that's the green, between 2016 and 2020. And what you can see here basically is that the numbers of resettlement have severely decreased, especially due to the USA and Canada, which dropped out of those activities largely. And even though on the European level there were increased activities in resettlement, these are really tiny numbers regarding the overall numbers of refugees who are in urgent need of resettlement. The UNHCR said in 2019 there was around 1.4 million refugees who urgently need a resettlement offer, but only 36,000 were resettled in the same year. So we already had, before COVID, we had a huge resettlement gap. And the outlook, I'm always trying to be optimistic. So my optimistic outlook would be that under the new EU Commission, which gave itself the slogan, a union that strives for more, there could be a collective effort, or at least maybe a coalition of some willing EU member states who are increasing their resettlement efforts. And probably this will mean that we have more those orderly resettlement efforts, meaning that you have pre-selection measures in first arrival countries, including, of course, health checks and security checks. And I think, or I hope, that's again, my optimistic outlook, that those local efforts and those local calls for solidarity and the showed willingness of solidarity from those city movements, like cities of safe haven, could speed up the process of those national considerations about how we can arrive at an increased resettlement of asylum seekers. And my hope is that this will not take years, but that we will have already some increased processes of resettlement in the year 2020. So thanks for your attention, and I hope I did not use up too much time. Damla, you have to unmute yourself.
For this very enriching presentation, it was very good in terms of making connections between what happened in 2015, what were the responses of the EU and EU member states, and what happens today, and what we can think of the days to come. So we are going to now move on to my presentation. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about governance of migration, control of migration in the context of EU-Turkey relations, and how this issue has been very much reified on the topic of migration control on the Turkey-EU border. So I am going to try to give some kind of background on this topic, how we came to the point that we are currently today, and I'm going to be talking about the issue of COVID-19 at the very end of my presentation, how should we approach to this issue. So as you all might know, Turkey is at the moment one of the very important countries receiving migrants and refugees, and this happened in a very short period of time. So since 2011, or more importantly since 2012, Turkey has been receiving very significant numbers of refugees coming from Syria, but also from elsewhere. The inward migration to Turkey, not only of refugees, but also of other populations, irregular migrants, and regular migrants has been having an increasing trend for the past decade. When we look at the figures, since around 2013-2014, Turkey has become the top host country of refugees around the world, and this has been very, very important in terms of the changing legal administrative environment in Turkey, and its position in terms of international relations and bilateral relations, especially with Europe. So I'm going to be okay, before I move, I just wanted to present, we are not talking about only Syrians. Syrians comprise, for some reason, my graph doesn't show very well here, but Syrians comprise around more than 3.5 million foreign nationals currently living in Turkey, but we also have other populations seeking for international protection in Turkey, including Afghans, Iraqis, Iranians, and others coming from Africa, Middle East, and other countries. Actually, as I had mentioned, there has been this overall rise in the numbers of migrants coming to Turkey, and migration from Turkey to the EU has become increasingly important in our day. Since the 1980s, Turkey has been emerging as an important transit country between the developing and war-torn countries and the developed EU countries. So the pull and push factors of origin and destination countries were very important, and Turkey's geographical position has been very important. But also Turkey's own policies towards migrants and refugees has been very important in terms of these mobility that is taking place, as the country provides very limited opportunities to people who are interested in permanently settling in a certain country and becoming naturalized. So these go back to Turkey's policies from 1934 law on settlement, where naturalization is very much available for those of Turkish origin and culture, and also to 1951 Geneva Convention, so the convention, UN convention that determined the refugee status in the international arena. So Turkey's participation, involvement of the Geneva Convention, and it's keeping the geographical limitations, so accepting only people coming from Europe as refugees, and not allowing the other individuals from other countries, other regions to become accepted as refugees. So its limitation against that also led many people seeking for international protection to continue on their mobilities to seek protection elsewhere. Over the last 5 years, or since, let's say, 2012, with the increasing numbers of migrants and refugees, this issue became more and more important. But actually, the relations between Turkey and the EU and this topic of migration and asylum, the management of migration and asylum, goes before that. EU has actually been a very important reference point in the transformations in Turkey's migration policy from early 2000s onwards. So this started with the harmonization process after the Helsinki Summit of 1999, when Turkey became a candidate country to the EU, and as a result of the accession process and the plans for harmonizing Turkey's policies with the EU acquis, there have been very, very important changes in Turkey's migration policies in the areas of legal, administrative spheres, capacity building, and which could be established through trainings, as well as networkings with international counterparts, not only by state actors, but also by the civil society working in services, and also advocacy. On advocacy. This initial period around 2000s until 2010s and mid 2010s, I find this period very, very important in terms of the general changing understandings. And it led it supported the process of creating new laws and new administrative structures, solidifying in 2013, and the law on foreigners and international protection, which created a very, very important instrument where Turkey's policies on migration and asylum were written and became entered into law, and it was actually a very liberal law, which very much owed to this EU process. Also, not only in terms of the legal and administrative changes, but according to our interviews during the Sosyal project and during our interviews for other projects, we have very much seen that the networking issue was very, very important. So in terms of the share of knowledge, not from the European side towards Turkey, but also Turkish stakeholders presenting their own interests, knowledge about the field, I found this period very, very important. This is the point where we were, and from 2005 onwards, we also had this process of the readmission agreement. As I had mentioned, EU was very, very important for Turkey in terms of the this knowledge, the transfer of knowledge, and changes in many different areas. But Turkey was also very important for the EU, a part of its enlargement and neighborhood policy, so a weird place between the two. And migration topic was very important as a result of the increasing securitization of migration in the EU, and this rising importance of the topic of migration, especially with the increasing threat perceptions, cultural and economic threat perceptions towards migrants and refugees. So Turkish, the policies towards Turkey and this readmission agreement was very much a result of this externalization of migration. So we use this knowledge in migration studies. So EU's attempts to control its migration outside of its own borders, stopping migrants before the entry was very important, and Turkey was a very important actor for the EU for this purpose. So we had this readmission agreement since 2005. It was mostly on the topic of Turkish nationals and third country nationals, and somehow it was signed in 2013 to be enacted in 2016. But during this period, we have this 2015 issue crisis, as it is called in the EU as a refugee crisis, but I will mention it as a humanitarian crisis. So it led to an increase in the politicization of the issue, reinforcement of the securitization discourse, and as Birgit already mentioned, the debates emerging in the EU between the EU as a supranational power, holding certain basic foundational norms and values, challenged by the emerging politics within the EU from member states, right-wing policies, but also the discussions about sovereignty. And as a result, from this readmission agreement negotiations, we shifted towards a new area of negotiations with the Turkey-EU deal in 2016, where EU would support the stay of refugees, Syrians in Turkey, so hold them in Turkey in response to providing 3 plus 3 billion, so 6 billion euros to support the ongoing infrastructural administrative transformations, and also funding education, health, protection, basic needs, socioeconomic support, and municipal infrastructure. So this EU-Turkey deal became very, very important. I argue here that the topic became politicized more and more after this period, and we witnessed the reification of the politicization, especially on the topic of border controls and irregular migration on both sides. So again, as I had mentioned, the policies of Turkey enabling little environment for the integration, a long-term stay of asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants due to its own policies, due to its own background, but also the EU's providing very little opportunities for such populations to reach Europe via regular means. So when we look at the different patterns of mobility of refugees, so I'm specifically talking about refugees here, but irregular migration, of course, is a broader topic. But usually when we discuss the humanitarian aspect becomes more problematic when we discuss the refugees. And when we look at the mobility of refugees, like those who would be seeking for protection, there are little opportunities for regular mobility from Turkey to the EU. So for Syrians under temporary protection, there are opportunities through relocation, for instance, under the EU-Turkey deal. Resettlement processes that continue, that is as a result of the cooperation between Turkish state and the UNHCR for most vulnerable cases, and some family reunification programs which are not very much actually declared. So they exist, but they are not very much declared. So this is an interesting point. For others, for non-Syrians, for conditional refugees in Turkey, again, there are opportunities for resettlement, but they are also very small in comparison to the mass number of people living in Turkey. And irregularity becomes a choice, not a choice, but an obligation for these populations to be able to reach a more durable solution. So against the unexpected, unforeseeable future, for many people, oftentimes irregularity can become a way to move on to a possible more durable solution. So many Syrians and asylum seekers use irregular paths to migrate to Europe due to uncertainties and long waiting periods. So when we look at the figures of resettlement, as I had mentioned, so here are some figures. Germany is, of course, a very important receiver in comparison to many countries of Europe. But again, we see very low numbers. So on the left-hand side, we have the resettlements of Syrian nationals to Europe under March 2016 statement. And on the right-hand side, we have here the resettlements from Turkey to the EU by the UNHCR. So this has been an ongoing process of resettlements, and for the most vulnerable cases, we still can talk about a very little number. So these also became a topic of discussion in Turkey and in Europe. So the aim of the EU-Turkey deal was to stop the mobilities, and there has been this one-to-one process where any irregular migrant who moved from Turkey to Greece, for one person who is sent back to Turkey, the EU was supposed to take one person in return as a refugee. And many people argue that not many people were sent back to Turkey. So many people ask whether this agreement had an impact, not maybe from a direct way, but indirectly, it had a huge impact stopping the flow of migrants. So seeing this, the negotiations, seeing the determinist positions of the both sides, many migrants and refugees opted not to try their chances for passing from Turkey to Europe. So as I have been arguing, this topic of the politicization of irregularity, border passages, has become very prominent, has become a very hot topic recently, and the border passages were really decreased after 2016, after the March EU-Turkey statement. But we are seeing that over the recent period, especially after 2019, there have been new border passages, new arrivals, or like new apprehended people from both sides. One of the important factors behind it might be this politicization issue and how it is being used in the state discourse in Turkey as a leverage against the EU, especially in times when bilateral policies, bilateral issues become problematic. So there have been some different periods when this has been very much negotiated. For instance, around 2016, when the EU-Turkey accession talks had been asked for a pause, and there are recurrent reminders of the state, of the government, to say that we are hosting this many people, you are betraying your promises. if you go any further with isolating Turkey from the talks, we are going to be opening the gates. So what we witnessed at the end of February this year is not something new. It has been actually an ongoing trend. This also took place, as I had mentioned, around 2019, especially with this safe zone that Turkey was planning to create in Syria. On the one hand, for its own domestic policy concerns, but also in order to be able to repatriate many Syrians back, in order to receive support from Europe. It was important for the Turkish state, so the Turkish state politicized this issue, and more recently, we are seeing, like after in 2020, at the end of February, we also saw that demands from the EU using this as a leverage against the EU was also coupled with some domestic policy concerns in order to change the agenda. So this topic has been ongoing. So this is a picture from 2015 when the migrants had marched themselves, which created a huge debate in Europe, leading to this EU-Turkey deal. So together with the border passages, this march was also very important. And today, when we come to 2020, we see a similar parallel issue. So with Ahmet İçduygu, we had written this article on saying it takes two to tango, while analyzing the readmission agreement between Turkey and the EU. We argued that oftentimes there are asymmetrical relations, but the Turkish state has been trying to use migration as a leverage. So this issue is becoming very much politicized by the Turkish government. EU's strong position between the beginning of the accession and the mass influx had actually this period when increased relations, increased transfer of know-how, it was very important during the process for preparing the law on foreigners and international protection in Turkey. And as I had mentioned, although mostly it was asymmetrical, what the Turkish stakeholders could join to the table, could bring to the table, was very, very important. The politicization of this issue, on the one hand, it challenges, it creates a difficult environment for the bilateral relations, but more importantly, of course, to the humanitarian aspect regarding how the management of migrants and refugees is going to be taking place. The EU's normative claims about human rights, the dignity of the individuals, that were very much announced before this were damaged after 2015, and Turkey was able to counter the hegemonic position of the EU using border management and migration to alleviate its leverage in bilateral relations. So when we come to today, we see that Turkey and EU are very much tied on the topic of migration and asylum. So we are recently seeing that our government announcing that we should seize the opportunity to start again, revitalize the relations between EU and Turkey. So the continuity of the relations from a perspective on migration and refugees is very important, because they will be continuing to be held together. This tie will continue no matter what. With the COVID-19, this issue becoming more and more challenging, of course, as Birgit also mentioned, there are worsening conditions for refugees in terms of unemployment and inaccessibility to basic services in Turkey as well, as in many other countries. But at the same time, I am seeing that my optimistic side sees that policymakers are also seeing that needing to safeguard the well-being of each individual for the well-being of all becomes more and more important. So we might see changing policies towards migrants and refugees who are actually within the borders of the countries. This might take place in different means. But we should also approach to this issue with caution, because the securitization discourse, which had been very much reinforced for the last decade or more, it can become more and more like reinforced as health becomes a new threat. There can be a new threat perception around the issue of health. So Antonio Vitorino, the head of IOM, said, for instance, health is the new wealth. So as an intersectionality with the class issue, being a migrant, being from another country, might be an important factor determining people's abilities to move. Thank you very much for listening. I think this will be all for my talk today. And so thank you. We are going to be moving on with Ahmet İçduygu and his presentation.
Damla, you are arranging my
Evet.
PowerPoint there. Okay, thank you. Okay, well, let me start by thanking Damla and Bahçeşehir University for this organization. It's nice to be here with Damla and Birgit on the same panel. The title of my talk is on the stranded migrant workers in the period of COVID-19. Particularly, I will focus on their return question home, repatriation of the stranded migrants. How I came to this topic actually in the last two months, one of my PhD students drove my attention to the case of Armenian migrant workers in Turkey. This is the kind of less known group. And we started working on the case of Armenian workers in Turkey because they are stranded here. But in this talk, I will not just focus on this case actually, because it is a kind of ongoing research, but I will try to elaborate the cases of stranded migrants. I like to provide a kind of framework from the historical perspective on the case of stranded migrants, but in referring to, of course, the period of the COVID-19. As all we know that the COVID-19 has the very huge impact on our lives, but not everyone affected equally. There are different populations affected in a different way, some of them less, the others more. But we know that, I mean, for instance, it's very much debated also. There's a kind of class dimension. Poor people, they are more affected, or elderly people, or in the US, Afro-Americans. And if we compare it with the native-born populations in any given country, refugees and immigrants also, they are likely more affected by this environment. But within the immigrants and refugees, actually, there's another group. They are what we call the irregular migrants. These could be irregular, undocumented migrants working in different industries in the host countries, or rejected asylum seekers, or even there are some refugee cases, but their status are not so clear. So these groups of people, actually, they have the very specific challenges and vulnerabilities they are facing in the time of COVID. What we know that from our observation, they are really stranded. They cannot go out. Also, they cannot function because they cannot work in where they live. So this return question, repatriation, because some of them, they like to move out from the host countries, but they cannot go home. So I like to take this question to the question of, as a question of global governance. And I will ask what type of global governance. As you know, when we focus the irregular migrants, actually, nation states, they consider these people, quote unquote, illegal. But what we know that over the last 3 decades around the world, irregular migrant workers became very integral part of the national economies in different countries, in different industries, and they became really essential for the economies. But this unregistered status of these workers, so these irregular positions, they pose several questions for them. First of all, of course, they are very much exploited in the economy. They cannot complain because they have the fear of risk of deportation. They cannot easily organize themselves into the labor unions, for instance, so they are quite disadvantaged. In general, they are very disadvantaged. When given the COVID conditions, also they became the more disadvantaged. What is discussed in this environment of COVID-19, it's a global health issue, but because it's pandemic nature, it turns to an issue of borders. We discussed borders often just related to COVID, and not as a reality, it's a kind of issue of borders, but also it becomes a kind of construction as a border issue. So this framework is constructed in our discourses. So looking from that perspective, what really how COVID affects the irregular migrant workers directly. First of all, of course, they can not easily access the health services during this period. They lose their jobs as the others because the economies just stop, and even some of them, like the domestic workers, they may use their housing because where they work, those people, those families may stop their working. So this environment becomes a kind of issue of survival for them. And one of the survival strategy could be returning, going back home. But since the borders are closed, they are stuck there. And the only way they can go out of, I will mention that if it's a kind of neighboring country, they may try to even cross the borders irregularly, but often this is difficult, but often they need the facilitation of the governments. If you can think of also if their home countries and host countries, they are not neighbor to each other. Think about the Indians or Pakistanis, they are working in the Gulf countries, they have to fight the flight. So they need a kind of quite big operation of governments and the international organizations to get out of this devastating situation. So what I did actually, I wanted to look at the whole issue a bit historically. In different crisis situations like the armed conflicts, uprisings, natural disasters, or pandemics as COVID-19, may create a kind of environment. We see this picture of the stranded irregular migrant workers, or in general, stranded migrant workers, even if they are not irregular. Very important relatively recent case is that in the 1991 Gulf War, when the war was taking place in Iraq and Kuwait, in fact, there was a huge issue because there were so many foreign workers, and it became a very big issue how to get out from this war situation. Even in the case of these workers, I remember if you look at the documents, for instance, 60,000 of them, they came to Turkey, then from Turkey, they managed to go their own countries. We have seen the same kind of stranded migrant situation in the so-called Arab Spring environment. So many stranded migrant workers, also they like to move out from Egypt, Libya, or Tunisia. What we see that in those cases, this became a kind of issue of governance, let me put it that way, but which needs a kind of very difficult operation, bringing together the different actors, some involved states, neighboring states, or the states of home states or host states partly, and the international organizations and the civil society organizations. So when we come to the COVID environment, what type of, in fact, the examples I can present, again, in the Gulf countries, these oil-producing Gulf-rich countries, you know that there are so many migrant workers there in several countries of the Gulf region, particularly from India and Pakistan, but from other countries like the Philippines too. Again, we know that this became a very huge issue. As far as I know, that they just I get it from the different documents. For instance, 200,000 of them, both from India and Pakistan. In fact, they applied to go out from from these countries to their homes. But of course, the flights they were very limited. Only very limited number of flights, they are arranged by the government, so it became a kind of issue. I will come to some examples related to that. So what one can argue that in an environment of COVID is that this type of crisis, in general, migrant workers, but particularly irregular migrant workers, they became a kind of in a situation we can call it lock-in and lock-out. This becomes a kind of puzzle for them, and their repatriation, their return becomes more complicated. So for this study, I'm working on the Armenians. Also, I'm looking at the different cases currently. For instance, you know that there was huge migration from Venezuela to the neighboring countries, like the Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. Again, this became a kind of big issue for them when they faced the problems in the hosting countries to go back their homes. Of course, some of them, they tried to manage just walking through the borders, which was difficult, but also they needed the operation of the governments. Same, we see that there's another case of the Ethiopian transit migrants in Somalia. Ethiopian migrants often using the Somalia and coming to the Gulf countries, and they are stuck there. They can neither go back to their own countries, nor just they can move further. At the Armenian irregular migrant workers in Turkey, as I said, that is an ongoing research. I will not go into the detail, but very briefly, let me mention that over the last 2-3 decades, there's a kind of pool of there are different numbers because, sometimes the government exaggerates that political reasons, like the 30,000 or 60,000, but apparently experts, a kind of expert judgment from the field is that the 10,000 Armenian workers, mostly in Istanbul, because of course, there's no diplomatic relation between Armenia and Turkey, and the border is closed. They came through the Georgia, but there was until recently there was also direct flight between two countries, and they stuck here. And I will come to that point actually, because really my talk will not be on the Armenians. Just maybe in the conclusion part, I will give a kind of example, or while I'm developing my argument. So what type of lessons we can draw these cases I already mentioned. One is that what we see that the failure of the international cooperation. Mostly when I look at those historical cases and current cases, it really depends on the so-called goodwill of the countries, either neighboring countries or some related countries involved. This is where this concept of goodwill even often comes in the official documents, like in different international organizations or governmental organizations. Sorry. Concerning the migrant workers, we have a kind of convention on the migrant workers in actually dated in 1990. Only currently 39 countries sign it. This gives certain rights to the migrant workers. But when we look at, and this is the only convention, only international basic document which may serve for this type of situation, but it doesn't function. Actually, there's no reference, for instance, to the stranded irregular migrants or even to the irregular migrants. But why I put this case that the particularly host countries in the developed world, they are very reluctant to sign this convention. So having this, of course, when we look at the case of the stranded migrants, one lessons we can draw that the host countries have some obligations, at least, to provide maximum care to these type of migrants in devastating situations. In relation to, if I come to again the issues of the stranded irregular migrants, if they like to go back to their home countries, for instance, they need a kind of exit visa, a kind of official arrangement, and the finance. This finance issue often comes to the picture. Even, for instance, some nation states, actually, the governments provide this transportation, but time to time also they ask the people they have to pay. Even I heard that, for instance, in the case of Pakistan and India, when they are in the COVID cases, when they arrived at those countries with this limited number of flights, in fact, they have to go to the quarantine period of the 14-15 days. They have to pay the facilities, just for the accommodation, food, etc. So this becomes, when we look at the return issue, with the financing the operation becomes a kind of issue too. There's the role of the neighboring countries, as I already mentioned, that in the 1991 Gulf crisis, actually, war, Turkey played a kind of role, for instance, as a neighboring country. Those stranded migrant workers from different nationalities came to Turkey. It became a kind of, with the involvement of UN and International Organization of Migration, and with various NGOs. In fact, they managed to go back to their own countries. But I already mentioned that if the home country is not neighboring country, the whole movement gets very complicated and difficult. So this takes us to the issue of but we may argue that this is a kind of field we need a kind of global governance and the good global governance. Here I want to, in the next two slides, I like to come into with this concept of what we mean with the global governance and the good governance, good global governance. Often when we look at the literature, over and over, we highlight the importance of the involvement of the related states. Here, it could be sending states, receiving state, and the transit or neighboring states, intergovernmental organizations like the UN, International Organization for Migration, or UNHCR, or civil society activism. I call this as a kind of, and when we look at again, this conventional understanding of global governance, it refers either this is a kind of vertical relation, top down or bottom up. Some scholars or some researchers, some policymakers highlight the importance, of course, NGOs, people, they organize and they push the international governments and the states to be active, or states, time to time, we know that the states are very active, or particularly international organizations are very active to create this type of environment. But increasingly, what we see that the particular field of migration becomes a kind of what everyone argues that this is an area of the global governance. It's very much valued by all these actors, people, NGOs, international organizations, and states. But what we see that particularly some of the actors, but mainly the states, are very reluctant to cooperate. So this brings me to other parts of the literature, how we can deepen the global governance. If, as a kind of policy area, a kind of policy design, if we can take the good global governance as a kind of policy design and looking at a kind of deepening of this framework. This brings me to the next slide. So what I will argue that this, again, in the literature, several scholars argue that we can look at these policy issues from a wider perspective. It's not only the issue of agencies, but larger than that. The first, they refer to a kind of structure. Structures mean that the broader, here I put the broader material and cultural context. So this is a kind of larger environment in which different actors and the institutions operate. Then when we come to the institutions are the formal or informal rules and regulations that inform the actors. So I mentioned, for instance, this convention, and then we can talk about different agencies, different actors. This could be the individuals here, the NGOs, the people on the street, migrants themselves, but the states, we can take them also as an actor and any collective entity. So what one can argue that the interaction of these three levels actually determines the quality of good governance, what I will argue. In addition to, of course, so on the one hand, we should look at the kind of vertical relation, but the horizontal relation, both widening and deepening of this field of the good governance. This will be my main argument here. I will repeat a bit myself, just if now I came to the conclusion. So what we witnessed, that there's a growing number of migrants who are having a kind of more vulnerable, exploited, and in fact, the COVID environment show us that. But again, COVID environment showed us that the migration-related issues become really global issues. But we need a kind of new management and the protection challenges, which implies that definitely the international cooperation is required. Also, international cooperation is important for the successful national application of the different programs and the procedures. I already mentioned that, so I will suggest that looking at the good global governance from a kind of wider perspective. A kind of last point I like to make, already Birgit also mentioned indirectly that what we witness in Europe, also in US, in different, particularly in the developed world, COVID environment show us that the migrant workers very functional for the food industry. This, I mean, just food security and food chain. And it became particularly, for instance, seasonal workers. And Birgit also mentioned that we see that in Europe and in US, there was this type of demand for that certain sectors of the economy needs labor, but the usual suspects in those labor, they are the migrants, even the irregular migrants. So I argue that maybe with this COVID pandemic show us a kind of, okay, irregular migrant workers could be mean a kind of risk, But looking at from that last point, that this could be a kind of opportunity, maybe to think again about the significant role of the migrant workers, particularly irregular migrant workers in different parts of the world. Thank you.
Much, Ahmet Hocam, for this very new debate that you are opening up with your new research that is currently ongoing. So it will be very interesting to read more about this. Probably we will read more reports and articles from you on this topic. There have been some questions coming from the floor, and I would like to, although Birgit has been responding to them, I would like to address them once again orally, because there might be others who might be interested in collaborating, contributing, and maybe Ahmet Hoca would like to add some words. So Selcan Öner asked this issue of solidarity and cities of safe haven. So Birgit had mentioned them during her presentation. So what kind of carrots and initiatives may be introduced by the EU to support these kinds of new environments, new opportunities, and in the future EU budget, will there be any regulations about that, she asked. And Hakan Yapar asked about the identity politics, how identity politics issues play out in EU's migration governance. Let's start with these two questions, and then we can move on to other questions that might be coming from the participants. Yes, Birgit, if you would like to. Yeah, you're already.
Yes, I'm ready because it's quite difficult to write it in the chat because both questions are quite broadly to be discussed, and I also think they are a little bit interrelated. Especially Hakan's question, I think, really interrelated to the last points that Ahmed made, the question of good global governance. And starting with the first question, how could we arrive at the EU level directly supports those municipal activities? We have to keep in mind that this all has to function within the structures of the European Union. So you have those different support programs where indeed regions or municipalities can apply for, but it's always a question of multi-level governance. So it's always there are always the other state actors in between, like between the local and the EU level. The national actors are always involved in all those regular processes, and especially if we come to the question to admit asylum seekers to the national territory. This is a question of national sovereignty to answer that. But on the other hand, what can be the positive effect of those local efforts? I think it's also it's highly symbolic. So it's a political symbolism showing that the people on the ground, and that's like the localities are those who are doing the reception work and integration work, that they are ready to do this work. And for the municipalities, on the other hand, this can be an incentive to engage in such initiatives, because there was like in the reflection of 2015, many municipalities criticized that they could not prepare the reception because it was just such a sudden procedure and they did not know who would come. So if we would more engage in those local resettlement processes, the localities could be involved much earlier and could really better prepare concretely to the needs of those people who will come. And then to the second question of Hakan, it's really like looking at how those different negotiations are effectively coming true. This is really a big research issue, I think, where you have to look into those multi-level negotiations, like the instruments people are using. I think that this really goes to Ahmed, this question, and his elaboration on those good global governance, so, because Ahmed already suggested a little research grid for this question.
I mean, if I come in, well, when we refer to the global governance issue or good governance, on the one hand, there are different actors. Of course, when we look at the actors also, there are some asymmetric relations between the actors too. So I think the representation of the actors we should focus on while we are elaborating. The plus, what I mentioned, that the larger environment both the institutions and the actors operate, because this refers to a kind of culture of the bureaucracy, political culture, social culture, and plus, since we are talking about a kind of global context where this regulations also comes to the picture. So representation issue is very important. I mean, over and over, of course, we think about there are different actors trying to collaborate each other. But as I said, some of the actors are less powerful, the other more powerful. So there should be a kind of way of, we are talking about a kind of setting where negotiations are going on. Important thing is that in that negotiations is that the really representation of the different actors, particularly those powerless actors, should be somehow communicable in that setting. Yeah, but also increasingly, for instance, importance of when we look at the European setting, this less applies to the Turkey and probably other parts of the world. The cities, for instance, city is getting very important. City administrations are getting very important because they are dealing with the individual cases, the migrants, their lives. So this multi-level, and other thing is that a multi-level aspect of the governance issue. But again, as I said, that this changes from one social setting to another. For instance, city level or this local governments are important traditionally in Europe, but which is not so applicable in Turkey. But overall, in my presentations, I said that probably we should look at a bit from the wider angle at the really we should discuss that, okay, everyone somehow think about something positive about the global governance or governance, but what should be the good one? How the good cases? We should be going into that detail. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have new questions coming from the floor. So one of them is from İlke Şanlıer. She is specifically asking about the agricultural workers. And she asks, do you think could the recent developments such as the need for agricultural workers in Turkey and elsewhere have an impact on the transformation of temporary migration regime? And she says, I am asking the question as the seasonal agricultural workers are the most precarious ones, precarious category. Can you speculate on that? So before moving on to Ebru Hoca's question, I would like to address this to Birgit and Ahmet Hoca, because I think both of you mentioned somehow this, somehow the use of labor, irregular labor or migrants labor in Europe and in Turkey, but maybe we can talk more about the seasonal agricultural workers more now. Yes.
So thanks for the question. in Germany, we have really hundreds of thousands of seasonal workers since the 1990s, starting with those contracts with the then newly transforming states in Central Eastern Europe. And until today, as I said, we have a lot of seasonal workers who come from Romania, Bulgaria, on temporary contracts for working on the fields. And we have another group of migrants who come under really bad conditions, also from, for example, Bulgaria and Romania, for working in the food industry. Like we had like some scandals lately in the slaughterhouse industry. This is a really, really bad job. It's mostly done by migrant workers, and they are badly exploited, and they are housed under really, really bad conditions, which are very much controlled by their employers. And only because we had some COVID outbreaks in some of those boarding houses, our labor minister proposed to make some new laws and regulations to end the exploitation. And in fact, I mean, we scholars, we have research on that since the early 1990s. And what is really sad, it always needs like a big crisis or some really big catastrophes until political action is really done in those fields which are out of our sight. And you could probably say the same for female care workers who are also coming in large numbers over the borders, and only when they were prohibited to come due to the border closures, this issue was really raised in a more proactive way. So this can be a moment where policies can change, and where also maybe the labor market structures can change, because we always have to ask, why do those labor market segments fully rely on external labor? Why cannot they transform their labor markets that they also find internal workers?
Thank you, Birgit. Ahmet Hocam.
Okay. Can I? Okay, for the İlke's question. Yes, I mean, in the case of Turkey also, we just had this experience in the COVID period. Of course, there were the seasonal workers seasonal workers from Turkey. I mean, particularly from the Southeast Asia, of course, moving to the other parts of the Turkey for agricultural work. Then for the tea plantation in the Black Sea region, actually, in the particularly recent years, the Georgians used to come, and the others probably too. So yes, probably COVID environment brought a kind of gave us a kind of lecture that there should be a kind of, I already mentioned, because of this food chain, food security, the importance of the agriculture, particularly seasonal agriculture, than the labor going into this industry. Certainly, I mean, she said that the speculation, I mean, it's the speculation, but probably there will be real discussion at some policymakers will move at that direction in this type of crisis environment, or even out of the crisis, actually. We know that the temporary migration regime is operating even out of this period, but more often there's also irregularities there, as the main lessons from the COVID, again, I'm repeating myself, but in the field of this food, yes, certainly I think there will be new thinking and the new formulation of the policies to have a kind of sustainability in economy, plus also this will bring a kind of idea how we can have the more sustainable migration regime, which will contribute productively to the economy.
Thank you, Ahmet Hocam. There was another question from Ebru Canan Sokullu, and she said, Italian government has recently proposed regularizing almost 600,000 illegal migrants as a part of pandemic management. I believe this is another short-term instrumentalization of the problem and not at all an example of good governance, she says. But I'd like to get the panel's view on this proposal, assuming that it would be replicated in other member states of the EU. If it would be an effective instrument of pandemic management, an indicator of good governance, or in the long run, it would contribute to another wave of growing xenophobia in Europe. Yes, I think this is a hard question.
I mean, just if I come in, this type of amnesties actually previously also they were common, bringing kind of regularization to the irregular migrants, particularly actually I have written that on before, as I remember, when we look at the 1990s, 10 years period, almost 4 to 5 million irregular migrants in the South European countries. There was amnesties from Greece to Spain and the other countries in the south of Europe. They regularized. Actually, this is again I made this argument. Economies in developed countries, they need labor, and often there's a discussion that increasingly, of course, they need a kind of skilled labor, etc. But we know that the different sector of the population, like agriculture, house care, etc. So there's a functionality of the irregular migration in those countries. And we know that there are so many irregulars there. And the economy is even the economic crisis time, they are able to absorb these migrants. They work. Of course, although there are also problems of unemployment. But coming to this example, yes, this is a kind of short-term thinking. And this should be a kind of more sustainable, more detailed policies to deal with the contribution of the migrants to the economies. This is a kind of type of ad hoc arrangement, of course, not a kind of really taught previously. Yes, I don't know whether the other European countries may get a kind of similar trend from the example of Italy. Well, this is it's the contribution of that to the xenophobia in Europe. If there will be a kind of trend that again this type, as I mentioned in the 1990s, those type of regularization programs created very much contributed to negative environment for the migrants, xenophobia, discrimination, etc. If this becomes a kind of huge issue, it may contribute to the xenophobic thinking in Europe. But again, the main issue really after COVID, how the states will take different measures concerning the migration. That's we have to think about.
Birgit?
That's all.
Yes.
Thank you.
If I may add some thoughts to Ahmed's argumentation, I think, as you said, Ahmed, there is a tradition in the South European countries for regularization. They always, like for example, Spain regularly did that, really showing that those irregular migrants who are needed in the labor market, who have been effectively absorbed by the labor market, don't really pose a problem in economic terms. And then at some point you had just a mismatch between those people who were part of the labor market but not part of society, like meaning having full citizen rights and or at least right of residency. If we come to today's situation, I mean, if Italy does that, I think it's just a pragmatic step. I cannot interpret it, what will come out of it, if this will cause more xenophobia or so, but I think it's just pragmatic. And what we in fact see in many other European countries is that asylum seekers whose asylum application has been turned down and who are just tolerated in those states because they cannot be deported under the COVID conditions. Of course, they cannot be deported at all because you don't have any air carriers and the borders are closed and so on. And just for this logical argument, in many EU countries, the toleration status has been prolonged, and there is some kind of relief for those people in the moment. And as we have those huge numbers of people who are living under the toleration status, which is not a regular resident status and does not leave a lot of possibilities for your personal development, in fact, it would be just logical to have some kind of way to regularize those people also. So these are not irregular migrants, but they are people who are just there because they cannot be deported. And I think we would all profit from regularizing them. The question of xenophobia, I must say, I don't know if this would make a difference, because if you, like, people who are xenophobic, people who are racist, they don't ask other people for their residence permit. They just judge by their stereotypes. So maybe this does not make.
Thank you.
any
I would
effect.
like to ask one more question before closing. So we have been talking about different levels regarding governance. We talked about the importance of rising importance of global governance, regional governance in the context of the EU, local governance. But I would like to ask about migrants agency, not only of those who are incorporated already in the host countries, but also do you think is it possible to incorporate migrants agencies like refugees and irregular migrants alike to all this discussion about governance? Because it becomes more and more important, I think, especially in such times of uncertainty where we do not have, where it might be difficult for the states to become knowledgeable about what takes place in the field. How would you respond to that?
I think in migration policy there is a general lack of integrating migrants' agency and migrants' knowledge into the political knowledge production, and this might be due to the fact that many migrants are hesitant to collaborate with policymakers, especially those who don't have a regular status. But in many other opportunities, they are just not asked. And if you ask them, or if you look what migrants are really doing, for example, also in this moment where we have this COVID crisis, you see a lot of solidarity among migrants, and you see a lot of specific knowledge that could help policymakers to understand what migrants need to play out their agency more effectively in the moment.
Would you like to contribute?
Well, yes, I mean, very briefly, again, this is, I mean, if I refer to my recent ongoing research about, for instance, the Armenians in Istanbul, and the others also, I'm reading the cases, as I mentioned, the irregular workers, migrant workers in other places. For instance, stranded ones, when I started first looking at that, I was thinking that of course, their decision is very important. Some of them, they like to go, but the others, they like to stay and they like to survive in that environment. So in that sense, understanding the migrant agency is very important. How they make decisions. In fact, for the policymakers and for the good governance policies, we have to be knowledgeable about how migrants, as the agents, they decide on certain conditions. We should not, naively assume that for instance, even in my talk, I said that, okay, these conditions, they are pushing them back to their own countries, but not all of them. In fact, I was expecting that, for instance, more people may ask, more Armenians in Istanbul, many of them, they may pressure the groups or governments, but apparently it's going on, but which was not the case. Only small numbers, in fact, they want to go to their own country. So certainly, I think looking at the migrant agency is very important to have a kind of good design of the good governance policies.
Thank you very much. So we already went beyond our time. Thank you very much to our panelists who participated today. I think it was a very lively and very good discussion we had with this webinar. So thank you very much for participating, and thank you to the participants who followed us. I hope you enjoyed it. And so thank you very much. And as I always say in my classes these days, stay healthy, stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you.
Yeah. And thank you, Damla, and thanks for the invitation. It was a pleasure to discuss
Thank
with
you all. Yeah, this was a pleasure just to be here.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone.